This episode of the Police One podcast is sponsored by Officer Store. Learn more about getting the gear you need at prices you can afford by visiting officerstore.com. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. You're checking us out maybe on YouTube, or maybe you're just listening on audio. Be sure and check us out in our show notes, where you will hear other articles by our guests today and some links to some of the products that we're talking about. Well, training is important, but it can be costly and time consuming. Virtual reality is one way to conduct training in smaller settings with a single instructor to maybe one or two students, with a variety of training simulations with immediate feedback and opportunities for multiple attempts at solving scenarios in a short span of time. But there are more ways to use virtual reality, and today we're talking with Dan O'Brien. And Daniel is a seasoned technology executive with over 24 years of experience in leading and managing the commercialization of emerging technologies, innovations, and solutions for consumers and professional customers. He is the HTC Vive President of the Americas, overseeing sales, marketing, product, and operations for immersive and wireless divisions of HTC. With a proven track record of significantly increasing efficacy across multiple use cases, VR is rapidly becoming the preferred training method for the armed services, Dan says. Vive headsets designed for privacy, security, and ruggedness are making a real-world positive impact, giving service members the confidence and muscle memory they need to handle dangerous situations more safely. And apparently 81% of VR trainees across the 5 branches of the U.S. military agreed in a recent survey. VR training is helping save people's lives by preparing them for combat and offering mental health solutions afterwards. And its trend looks to accelerate. It's an amazing story worth telling, and we have the guy to tell it. Welcome to Policing Matters, Dan O'Brien.
Jim, thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to be here.
Yeah, we've been chatting a little bit about the benefits, the multiple benefits of virtual reality training. We know that Axon and others have been supplying virtual reality at police agencies across the country. Tell us about the Vive applications.
The Vive applications, and specifically with Axon, it's a really incredible partnership. They have this goal of removing the need to have a bullet, right, and a gun in the field, and having those lethal exchanges. I think what we have found is some really high value scenarios where we can train high stress environments and situations that a lot of officers will never really have unless they're in the field, right? Like, there's so much you can do in training in facilities, whether it's at a gun range or a taser range. I think a lot of officers have found, training with tasers is extremely expensive. The darts are expensive. The amount of time that you can get on range with them is expensive. And so what we have actually done with Axon is actually integrated our tracking technology that would be in like a controller or something that you would work with, and actually put that into a taser. So now, as a safety officer, that's maybe even training at home on their own time or training in the training facility, they can get unlimited reps, right? And so the cost is coming down, heavily, right? And cost reduction, and then retention and training performance is going through the roof, right? So we're seeing, retention rates at, over, 75% for simulation training, right? Where you're using kinesthetic training styles, right? Your eyes, your ears, your hands, your body, as opposed to a lecture in a room, or, reading, a training facility, or reading a training documentation, right? Being able to have that efficacy and being able to have that scenario is very, very real. I've been through a lot of these scenarios myself, and they're very real. They're very stress inducing, and they're very dynamic, right? And so you can be, in in a 1 a.m. in Skid Row with a raining and pedestrians with camera phones on you, dogs barking, and just a very high stress scenario. So we've seen where you can really make these very dynamic situations, and train at a much more effective rate.
Yeah, and I know in law enforcement applications, the things you're talking about, just showing up on scene, maybe gathering evidence, documenting evidence, talking to witnesses or victims. You can do that in role play exercises, but that not only do you have the student, but the role player, and then an evaluator, and then a debrief afterwards. And maybe it's a one-off, maybe you get 2 or 3 chances. But like you just said, in virtual reality, the number of attempts are unlimited, really.
Right. When it comes down to it, right, it's always comes down to sets and reps, right? If you want to become really effective in that training style. Being able to put the trainee through all the different decision options, right? Could be a suicide intervention, could be a crisis intervention. There's a lot of ways that you can begin, start with the top down strategies instead of going immediately to more aggressive response, right? And I think every officer has to evaluate that, but we're all under stress, right? When we go out into the field, and you have one of those interactions, your body's under stress, your cognitive load is under stress, your decision making is diminished, and your body and your biology is taking over. And when we look at it now, how do we actually get people more confident in the field to make the right decisions? Well, you can train them over and over and over again in those high stress scenarios. And it's like training somebody to run towards fire instead of running away from it, right? But how to stay calm inside of it. What we have actually found was a PricewaterhouseCoopers study found 275% more confident, right? And I think you called it out earlier. 81%, of respondents said they were more confident. So, it's not completely replacing training, but it is such a great addition and way more cost effective, whether you're a large organization or a smaller organization. And it really gives you that scale to train over and over and over again. And then you get to actually work with professional trainers afterwards and go, okay, these are the decisions you made. What are we going to learn from them? What are we going to do differently? Right. It gives you that real learning tool, and then go, okay, now let's do it again.
Yeah. And I think as a recruiting tool, it can really give some insight into someone with no law enforcement experience, gives them at least
Sure.
a glimpse into it. And we've seen academy recruits go from week 1 experience to week 15 to week 30, and the advancements that they make, in part because they've never experienced anything like the training we do in law enforcement. We talked a little bit before we started recording about, the time perception when we talk about, or we watch something like boxing on TV. And then when you get into a real boxing environment and you have to fight for 3 minutes, about a minute into it, you're thinking, holy smokes, isn't this 3 minutes already, right? And the
That's right.
same goes, I think, for a new recruit when we tell them, okay, here's the situation, this is the scenario. You've got somebody sitting on the edge of a building or a bridge, and maybe they're going to jump, but you don't know. And in this era of de-escalation, where everyone wants police to slow it down, that means that that person has to pick up the acumen to be able to talk at
Right.
length for several minutes. And what do you say to someone sitting on a bridge besides don't do it? People care about you. You have a family. What do you do for the next 9 or 15 minutes?
Sure. And I think there's incredible ways that you can bring, what the soft skills training, right? And go, okay, here's 5 questions, that you can work that person through, and then put them in that high stress situation too, right? Where they'll think through those 5 questions. Just get them talking, just get them to calm down, just get them, that person to kind of respond and come out of, that crisis that they're in, and I think just being able to identify someone's in crisis, right? I think one of the really interesting things that Axon has a stat on is I think over 80% of lethal interactions between safety officers and civilians is with somebody that's in a mental health crisis. That's okay. So that's a scenario right there. Okay, officers really do need, the access to the training to identify when a person is in mental health crisis, and it can be subtle. It doesn't always have to be this very, very, boisterous or volatile or demonstrative, scene or scenario where things become obvious. Things can be subtle, and you have to be able to identify that and pick up on those cues.
Yeah, for sure. And we're talking about law enforcement applications now, but you've had a lot of success in military applications. And in the interest of our military and our military veterans, you're helping introduce VR training to our military. Tell us about those applications.
Sure. I mean, we've been working with several branches of the U.S. Air Force, whether it's special operations or whether it's just Air Force ground crews. I mean, we are training mechanics how to maintain planes that are on the ground, right? And if they are out in deployment and a forward operating, environment, how to train and maintain and perform maintenance on aircraft.
Mhm.
We are working with Marines. We are working with the U.S. Army. We are working with the U.S. Air Force. And we are starting to work with the U.S. Navy. But training is something that, quite honestly, the military is maybe the best at, of all their things that they do. Training is something that's near and dear and inside of their organizations and their branches. And so what we have found there is much more effective, time in field, downfield, highly volatile training prep scenarios. Over 76% of respondents, or 77% of respondents from our 400-person survey, just for the military only. And the great thing about that survey was 400 people were asked to do a survey, 400 people executed that survey. So I wish the private sector was as effective as doing their surveys, but the military is very good at it.
Well, to be fair, you have a captive audience in the military.
Right. That's right. But 77% said, that it did prepare them for very, very dangerous real world scenarios. Right. So, not, unlike what we're doing with safety officers and police, with Axon and companies like VARM, and Apex Officers, another company, but looking at the military applications, we have several companies that are doing everything from those volatile training simulations to maintenance, right? Like if you're asked to save, a couple $100 million in the DoD, you can do that by training people how to maintain, diesel trucks, right? And it doesn't always have to be, a gun or a hostile environment training. Yes, very, very effective training that we can do in those scenarios. But we can do a lot of effective training that, whether it's on the engineering side, the Army Corps of Engineers, we can simulate out towns, water flow, communications. So there's a lot of like what falls into like that digital twin world of, infrastructure, planning, communications. I look at all of those scenarios and you go, okay, great. You've completed an exercise, you've moved forward, you've stabilized an area. Okay, great. Now, how are we going to bring in materials, to, the people that are on the ground there that need aid, support, whether it's the supply chain to keep moving lines forward or to, maintain safety and order for, environments that have been now, deemed safe for green zones. So I just think there's a lot of scenarios there where we're seeing a lot of effectiveness, and it's cost savings, it's efficiency, and the training efficacy is through the roof.
Yeah. And for our military veterans, beyond preparing our men and women for combat, you also use the virtual reality to help with PTSD therapy. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a pretty new field, but we're finding a lot of great success there. There's some great veteran groups that have been looking at what are the applications that they can bring into play, right? There's a lot of therapeutics that can be done through virtual reality, and what our younger generation of safety officers or military might consider gameplay, right? But there's real science behind it. There's great companies like Axios VR, right, that's working on midbrain blood flow, right, improvements for people that are in, that's had trauma or, is trying to recover in a PTSD, types of environments. They're working on suicide prevention tactics. There is, a lot of research studies and work that other groups like Skip Johnson at USC, what he's been doing for post-traumatic, PTSD recovery for veterans. We're at an all-time high right now when it comes to suicides and veterans, U.S. veterans. I think we're up in the 60s per day. So it is an epidemic, of suicide, for our veterans. And, we're very aggressively, working towards modalities and solutions that we can use with the VR headsets, whether it's augmented, solutions or virtual solutions. But there's a lot we can do here that's in addition to talk therapy, in addition to, the traditional modalities for recovery. And I think we're going to bring a lot of good, that way.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Maybe that's another conversation we'll have down the road. So the German army is using your systems extensively with up to 97% results. Are we ever going to get to that level of use and subsequently satisfaction here in the United States?
Well, I would say we have a much bigger audience to address with the U.S. branches, from the Army to Navy and all the way to Space Force, right, and everything inside the federal government. We have a much bigger population to serve and to help. We're seeing great movement, with our armed services, in terms of adoption. 75% of people that aren't using it today inside of the military, inside of the major branches from the U.S. government, 75% said they were planning to implement XR training. XR stands for extended reality, so that it's encompassing augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, which is kind of a mix of real world and augmented, components. But 75% of users are planning to implement it by 2028. So within the next 3 years, I do think it will be pretty ubiquitously deployed within, the major branches of the U.S. government. I think there's a lot of positive momentum from everyone from the Surgeon General, of the armed forces and the DoD, to the leadership, right, of each of those branches. And with the German army, 85% of respondents said they had a clear understanding of complex processes, right? So that's when you're doing kinesthetic learning, instead of somebody that can just go through, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but when somebody can go through a training and they got it, that's great. There's a whole bunch of us that don't learn that way, right? And we know lecture style is 5% retention. We know reading is 10% retention. We know kinesthetic learning with your eyes, your ears, your hands, and simulation is 75% retention. So we as human beings all learn very effectively with our eyes, ears, and hands and everything. So it's a much more effective tool, right? And effective retention tool. But I think, just seeing with, deploying with like the German army, we've seen great efficacy. And I think that's super effective data that we can share with, different groups and different branches of the U.S. DoD.
Yeah, and hopefully law enforcement as well. And I'd like to take a quick break to thank our sponsor, but I want to get back and talk about the law enforcement specific applications. Officer Store, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at officerstore.com. And I'm back and speaking with Dan O'Brien from HTC and talking about Vive and the other virtual reality applications. We talked about the applications for military, and now we're going to move a little bit into law enforcement specific. And I want to start by saying, Dan, we just talked about pedagogy, the way we teach, the way we learn. Like you just mentioned, that some of us pick something up first go round, no problem. Others, we need that other cross section of experience, whether we read and then digest it and then talk about it or write about it, or have a couple of chances to put our hands on it and experience it. The knock on virtual reality, usually from trainers, reality trainers, is that it cannot replace real hands-on training experience. And what's your take on that?
Um, I'm not going to disagree with people that have dedicated a career to their training. I think it's a great tool, though, right? We talked a little bit earlier about sets and reps, and if your students can be doing training, in their barracks, right, or they could be doing it at home, and then get that training time in. If they can get sets and reps with their taser instead of their pistol, or their rifle, the more you train and the more comfort you have that you can get out of a high stress, crisis response with a non-lethal response, the more you're going to go to that instead of the lethal response. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I just think in general, it's a great tool, and there will always be some people that say, it's not good enough. And to be honest with you, in a lot of ways, a lot of the trainers that I've dealt with over the last 5 years of, doing a lot of this type of training, is the content wasn't very good to actually be effective. And we've made really incredible strides over the last several years, and the complexity of the training and the value of that training. So that's all taken time, right, to actually get that right. I think now it's more about looking at those trainers that might say it's not good enough. And I would say, you're now my consultant to tell me how to make it better, and make it more effective, because I want to make your students more effective in the field, and I want to make you more successful as a trainer. So how can I better serve you? Right. So they're my number one customer, before I get to the trainee, is really the trainer. And is it a tool for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I think one of the best benefits of VR training is the repetition and the students' opportunity to get way more repetitions than in real life. You mentioned a little bit about debriefings or after action, after a student or recruit's been able to go through a simulation wearing a VR headset. What's that like? Do you have a printout? Do you have a video where the student could observe what they're doing while they're training with a VR headset?
Yeah, no, there's absolutely, you can record all of it, right? And so you can record the playback, and then you can be in that debriefing room, not just with that student and the teacher, but with an entire room of students. And you can say, here's what happened. Here's the scenario. Here's how it all played out. When you look at it too, it gets even more complex, because now we actually have rooms, right, where we can have a small warehouse, right, 1,000-meter square environment where we can train with teams, right, and up to 15 to plus users at once, all wearing headsets, all in that virtual scene together, right. And so not only can you just train with one-on-one, right, of a safety officer in the field, you can also now train with, okay, here's your team of 6, all right, and here's what you guys went and did, and here's, hey, number 3, you got to stay, closer to number 2, and you got to watch, you were facing the wrong direction, at this time, and you put, the other 2 guys in front of you at risk, right? And so you can really kind of do that triage in a much more effective way, where it's all recorded, and then it's like, okay, great, now let's go back, let's do it again. And I think the learning and the cycle time to do corrections or course corrections is very fast, right? And it's very effective. And I think it gives people the opportunity to just learn much more quickly. And I think it's a great tool. It's such a fantastic tool. And then I think also too, it's a better tool for once somebody does need to be certified, say it's on specific equipment or scenario. before they're in the field and they're allowed to, like, you can really gather that information and go, okay, great, we are 100% trained. They've passed all the criteria. They really do understand it. There's all of those components where we might say, oh, we've evaluated that person and they're ready to be in the field. I think what we're also maybe not, calling out completely is that student. We know that that student is going to be upwards of 200% more confident on the training and in being in those environments and being in those situations. So their confidence level, we know that from this type of training, that when they go in the field, they're going to be much more confident, to operate and, follow the correct procedures and to, de-escalate properly and respond in high stress scenarios.
Yeah. Wow. So the imagery you just conjured up there with that description made me think of what we think about when we think of Halo and Fortnite and a bunch of kids sitting in their living room or their basement with pizza boxes and Mountain Dew cans all over, and they're just sitting back doing it. But then you contrast that or juxtapose that with a stack of SWAT officers all experiencing the same thing, going into this warehouse that you're talking about and actually moving through the scenario. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And, I think the other thing that's really effective about it too is whether you're doing mental health scenarios and simulations, for officers, or you're doing training exercises for the officers, doing them in this format with the younger generation that you're trying to draw into this as a career path. This is a good thing. This is how they like to train, gamified a little bit. It resonates with them, and so it becomes much less of a burden ask and much more of a, yeah, I get to train today. This is kind of fun and it's exciting. And, as opposed to, I got to go train. So I do, I'm making some assumptions there about, how much people do or do not like, training. I've done a lot of training in my career. Compliance training always gets the, but sorry to all the compliance trainers out there. But but when I think about it, I go, okay, we have a lot of digital natives, right? And when we think about safety officers and population of where we are in terms of, shorthanded, right, police forces, whether it's NYPDs or it's the LAPDs or, Chicago, the major metropolitan areas, we know that there's a shortfall, right, of safety officers for a number of reasons, right? But a lot of people younger generation are not choosing the path to go in and serve as first responders.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a great tool, for people that do want to go in and you want to have them be the most effective, people and success that they can be, in the field.
Yeah, totally. And I agree with your assessment on training. Those compliance trainings that you sit in the computer and their time, so you can't just skip through them. You've got to sit there and look at this thing. 100%. Much rather go in the field, shoot at a range, move around. And I think my students are the same way. I teach at university, and at the beginning of a semester, if I introduce small group exercises where they've got to discuss and then do and then explain, they're hesitant at first, but by the mid to end of the semester, they're totally jazzed to rather do that than sit through me standing at a podium, blah, blah, blahing with maybe some PowerPoint behind me. 100% with you there.
Yep. As engaging as we can be as teachers, professors, and sharing our information, we know the retention rates on it's pretty low. And it's not just retention, once you've had the class, it's retention and loss over time. So we can measure over the next 6 months, and somebody that was kinesthetically trained, in a real live, virtual environment, their retention rates are, I think, they might drop off about 5 to 10%, but they're still well over 50% retention. Whereas the people that were just lecture style trained, not only did they forget quite a bit of that information, 5 minutes after they left that room. Ask them 6 months later, and they'll say, "Yeah, I took a class on that."
Yeah, right.
So, loss over time retention is also a real thing, right?
Mhm.
And so the kinesthetic, what we also know now with virtual and immersive training, is loss over time is much more effective. So the efficacy really stays with the student.
Yeah, totally agree. So I want to wrap up, but I want to get your viewpoint on smaller departments. And we know that 85, 90% of all law enforcement agencies are less than 50 people, many of them much less than 50 people. How can they compete in this VR market? They've got small budgets, 90% of their budget is for personnel. It's slim margin to upgrade to VR. How can they get involved as well?
Well, I think there's a lot of people should reach out to us. They should talk to us about that. I think people might have a misunderstanding of how expensive this stuff really is. And when you look at cost of training over the course of a year, and then effectiveness versus cost of immersive, adding on or augmenting into your processes, some virtual training and immersive training modules and modalities, it can be pretty cost effective, especially over a 1 to 3 year time frame. What we have found is we reduce cost of training. And when we looked at the National Training Laboratory, they measured almost a 85% reduction in costs, for training.
Hmm.
So while there's an initial capital, expenditure to do this, when organizations and when leadership organizations, that are supporting the different police organizations, are looking at those budgets, a lot of times we look at them, in the next 6 months or the next year, and you might be an election year, right? And all those kinds of fun things, right? And all those things come into play. But when you look at real effectiveness of training over time, we can massively save, and reduce costs of training. So when I think about those smaller organizations, it's great to let the big, organizations and the big police departments that might have, larger budgets to work with, to prove it out, right? And get through that proof of concept and some of those pilots, and then go, okay, here's proof. We know it works. We do know it works. And so I think now, for those smaller organizations and the smaller police groups, they should reach out to us, because we're happy to talk to them about how we can help them reduce the costs, right? And the old rule of thumb used to be, buy something and within 18 months, it pays for itself, right? But we've seen where you can, you're having your cost savings in under 6 months to a year.
Nice. Well, thanks for all the information today. And we're going to put a link to your website, contact information for those smaller agencies who might be interested in talking about getting into the VR training. Thanks so much, Dan O'Brien, a technology executive with HTC Vive, and appreciate all that you've shared with us today.
Jim, thanks so much for having me on. And, this was great. And I really hope we can do some great work together.
Yeah, for sure. And to our listeners, check out the links below in our show notes. Check out the virtual reality options. And I got to say that I'm a believer in virtual reality. The steps that have been taken, the leaps that have been taken, in the last decade are just huge. I expect more virtual reality enhancement. We're not only seeing the visual, we're hearing the sound. Some of them have some motion that simulates the external environment as well. And the ability to break it down and to debrief afterwards, so valuable. And hopefully it helps in training and saving lives, and the PTSD applications. I'm really looking forward to those in the mental health and wellness as well. So thanks for listening. Drop me a line and let me know what you think. policingmatters@police1.com is our email. That's policingmatters@police1.com. I hope you're all good and safe and well, and stay safe. And I hope to talk to you again real soon.